morning at my hotel room. It's the International Herald Tribune, which is, of course, not Israeli. It's published by the New York Times Company. But I just brought it because I wanted to talk about what news is to a certain extent. And I want to just look at what is on the paper. So the lead story is giant steps in teaching computers to think like us, which is, of course, a startlingly unusual story. Then we have, in Portugal, inmates hit hard by crisis on outside. I don't know what that's about, but it's about bad news, right? Definitely bad news. And then the lead picture is, of course, about Gaza and a story, shooting tests promise of Gaza's ceasefire, which of course is also bad news. Then if we go to the back, following ceasefire, PR efforts underway to encourage tourism. I was on an airplane that came here, United Airways, big airplane, and it was maybe 20% full of people. There were a lot of cancellations, but it was to my benefit because I had space to rest. Number of commercial air accidents drops. Now that's not bad news, that's good news, but it's unusual news, right? Because there are a certain level of air accidents, across the world, and to have a drop in something that's actually unusual is itself unusual. Then we have layoffs at Texas Instruments expected here this week, and let's see what else we have. I need to log in the interim. It's still not my desktop. That is the oddest thing. Okay. I will go on to the front page of the next section. And the lead article is cutting a smoother escapement. I don't know what that is, but there's a picture of an expensive watch and, of course, an ad for an expensive watch. So things that are expensive are unusual to me and to you, maybe. And so things that are not possible in our life systems are unusual, and they make news. People want to read about things that they can't afford for some reason. It's not really clear to me. And then we have threats. Israel and Turkey renew contacts to repair relations. That sounds like good news, but it's actually saying there are problems. There are big problems, and we need to do something to fix those. After Arab Spring, Morsi faces winter of discontentment, and of course, for having participated in the negotiation for the ceasefire, he now, president of a newly democratic government, is taking all of the criticism that any president of a democratic government takes. And so he's being, this is bad news for him, right? Because he's being yelled at by people who should have been happy for his elevation into international relations and as a positive form. Under rocket fire, school in Tel Aviv is anything but normal. It's bad news. There's a fear in the election that the Hawks will sweep Likud primaries, and that's a bad news. Army won't budge, so coastline may pay. This environmental article, bad news for the environment. And on police chief wants reform as Lieberman case falters. Jabari deputy likely to be Hamas's next military commander. Well, I don't know if that's good news or bad news, but Egypt's top judges slam president's decision to take near absolute powers. Egypt again. Lebanon army arrests Syrians over bomb plot. Dallas star Larry Hagman dies at 81. I don't know. If you're an American, that might be good news because of the show he participated in. Yes. Okay. I was just about to make my point.
Okay, so make your point, and then we're going to switch to that.
Thank you. Okay. The point I was leading to is that news is about stuff that is either unusual in some way or that violates laws and norms, social norms, or that threatens social change. News is about all of those things. And it may be good news, but good news, like, okay, there's a cure for cancer. Wow, good news. But it's actually laying on top of previous stories over time that cancer is bad news. So the fact that we have a cure for cancer, wow, unusual, but also you get the emotion of all those people who have died all these years before the cure is found. So
where is the presentation down here?
Yes?
Where is it? Because now we see this on the screen. We just need the presentation.
Well, then I can. Oh. Okay. Do you see that?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. It's a big file. It takes a bit to come up. It's an unusual piece of software. It's the timeline software. So excellent. We are. Okay, can we make this bigger? It's very small. The computer has, that's all right. We'll go with this.
Let's not push it along.
It will go. I'm confident you're right. Right. I'm also speaking from my iPad because I have some slides here. I couldn't decide whether to show them or not, and I think especially now it's a good idea not to. I'm sorry, I'm not used to speaking into a microphone. All right, well, what I wanted to, Akiba gave me the job, not a small job, of telling how news has changed since a 1969 publication, I think, by Herbert Gans, Deciding What's News. And he wanted me to talk about how news has changed from 1969 until now. Well, like Akiba, I'm a lifelong overachiever, so I decided to start in 1895 with Gustave Le Bon's, he was a social psychologist, his book, Psychology of Crowds, which I think sometimes is just known as The Crowd. And he was talking about, how people act differently in crowds than they do when they're alone. You go to a football game and you act crazy, but if you're by yourself on the street, you don't act so crazy. So his point about the media was that the media were partially responsible for this, that newspapers were always writing contrary articles, contrary opinions about politics in France, and that if they were exciting the crowd. So he's giving a lot of power to the media, and I'm confident that there are people before Gustave Le Bon who gave power to the people. Our vice president is a historian and undoubtedly knows that. But this is where I chose, instead of 1969, this is where I chose to begin. Excuse me. The reason I publish all that stuff is because I sit in my office by myself and I don't do anything else. When I have to do presentations, I'm always somehow doing something wrong. Okay, next I'm moving to 1922. Robert Park, a sociologist, wrote The Immigrant Press and Its Control. And although studying media was not his main objective, he did publish many things about the media. Now, I'm introducing some colors here. Gustave Le Bon was green, and since he was a psychologist, I decided to put his book on more a micro level, even though crowds are obviously macro level. But his point was how individuals act within crowds. So anything that is more micro in terms of research, level of analysis, some psychological sometimes, but other times just talking about people, is going to be on this level, green, and then blue is assigned to more sociological works, as Parks is. Okay, now we're going to move to a non-academic, a non-academic piece, there we go, by Mertz, I don't know Mertz, 1925, What Makes a First Page Story. And this is red because I assigned red to things that are not really scientific, but they talk about journalism. So you can think of red as just journalism, okay? So I have a macro and a micro and a level of research that just talks about basically the production processes that news is carried out through. Then to 1927, propaganda technique in World War, which of course referred to World War I, and Harold Laswell, who continued to be very productive over the following years, has been extremely powerful in our field. And he was working with interviews and observation about how pamphlets were dropped from airplanes, both by the Germans and by the Americans, and that was propaganda. And it was a time when propaganda was thought to be really, really powerful, and kind of you get it, you're hit by it, okay, you've got the message. But that is not the way things really work. But that was in 27 how people thought of information that was propaganda. Seldes wrote Freedom of the Press in 1935. So there are, I made this red because I think it's just a discussion about the how the press are free or not free in a country. And then in 37, Roston wrote the Washington Correspondence. And then Robert Park in 1940, News as a Form of Knowledge. Then Ralph Nafziger, International News Coverage and Foreign News Communication in 42. So you see the discussion of international news, especially, is not a new one. And then The People's Choice in 48 by Lazarsfeld was about the 1940 study in a county in Ohio in which he went into the study thinking that political propaganda, he used those words, were going to be very powerful in the election. And as it turned out, he didn't really measure anything that would have allowed him to discover whether media were powerful or not. And he could count, but he couldn't count the right things. So he came out of there saying, the media are not powerful at all in politics. It's what people think that matters. So that had a serious effect on research in media from that time on. It was 1972 before a university national survey in the US even asked a question on this general topic survey about, how many days a week do you read newspaper? It was from, 1940 to 1972 when the media were in a black hole, sort of. But Robert Merton was writing about social theory and social structure. Now, he's not writing about news, but I want to give you the flavor of the kinds of things that later researchers grew up on, the important things in their lives. The mathematical theory of communication by Shannon and Weaver turned out to be called information theory in most cases, and about senders and receivers and channels. And that was finally taken to mean that the media were the channel between journalists and sources and the audience. Then UNESCO published one of the first pieces about the flow of news around nations. And world communication, press, radio, film, and television. They did a lot of research, which Akiba says wasn't very good, but it was the beginning of a lot of cross-country research looking at which countries sent news, which countries received news, and which countries were lost in what is later called dead ground geographically, that nothing happens to North Americans, nothing happens in South America. Nothing happens. So we don't get any news from there because nothing happens. I mean, that's kind of the logic that goes. The truth is nothing happens because they don't have anything we want or care about. So news is not a pure and delightful product, as is government. There's a dark underbelly to both of those. And this did actually start to show that the dark underbelly of news, in that some countries are just blank in the world news. and others are very powerful. Now, Innes, a Canadian scholar, wrote in 52, Changing Concepts of Time, wrote several other things after that. I had to really pare down what I included because in later years there are a lot of things. And very influential nonetheless, theoretically. And I am personally interested in time, so I selected that one. Warren Breed was, I put him on the micro level because he was talking about people who come into a newspaper. Maybe they haven't worked for a newspaper before, or maybe they worked a few years for a newspaper. They come into the newsroom and they have to learn how to get along in this new organization. And so they learn the rules of the game. They learn the rules that are explicitly communicated, sometimes policies of publishers that are sent down explicitly, but there are implicit rules too about what kinds of things we cover, what kinds of things we don't. And so this was, as it turned out, very influential work by Breed. Transmitting World News in 53 again. Personal influence. This is Lazarsfeld again with Elihu Katz. Katz was the one who really figured out what theory to apply to Lazarsfeld's data. And so Personal Influence was a dramatically influential book that said that the media had no effect on anything. And then we have Breed again, Social Control in the Newsroom. And then I found this last night. I was looking for early works. Psychiatry, Press, and the Public, Problems in Communication by the American Psychiatry Association in 1956. The Power Elite by Mills is, again, a very influential book and brought to the subject of studying news, the fact that the media, not being so pure and delightful, are actually part of a power structure in society, and that they are either influencing or being influenced, or they are working for the government in a way, and they're working for the status quo. They do something, right? But that power is very important. Wesley and McLean came up with a model to represent mass communication in which he took the sender and the receiver, and he took from information theory this channel idea. And so senders were A and receivers were B, and in the middle was C, which didn't make any sense to me, but in the middle was the media. And X's represented events. And this is one of the first models that I know about in which it was explicitly recognized that news is always about events. Even opinion pieces are about things that have happened in some geographic location. And event-oriented research will continue to be very popular. Roy Carter, Newspaper Gatekeepers and the Sources of News. I forgot to put Kurt Levine's work here. He's a social psychologist who post-World War II was interested in changing society's food eating habits. And he developed a theory of gates and gatekeepers, he said, that would help this food problem. But in one small sentence, he said, and, you know, I think this theory can also be applied to blah, 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 and news. And so that was like a spark plug for people to study how items of news passed from, say, observers of an event, sources, experts from the government, and got to the journalist, and the journalist says to the editor, should I write about this? He says, well, okay, and then writes about it, and the editor doesn't like part of it and cuts part of it and changes most of it, and finally it gets through to typesetting, and they make some mistakes, and it gets through to other printing production processes, and the article may run off the edge of the page if the printer's not set up correctly. And finally, it's offered to the audience in a newspaper, this information. But the information that started in the channel was not the same information that came out at the end. And so this was this gatekeeping research, as it has come to be known, is about just that, how news, the original information that happens, that's given about an event, is molded and shaped and pummeled until it finally becomes a news article, or in now television piece, or now blog post or Twitter tweet, and but it's never the same. It's sort of like when you talk about when you give one person information who gives it to another, who gives it to another. The information at the end is not the same as the information at the beginning. We know that from interpersonal, small group communication. But it's the same way with news. Information is given, blah, 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 through the newspaper, blah, 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 and what comes out at the end is not the event. People say, I like to watch television news because it gives me a real sense of what it's like to be there. Totally untrue. Totally and completely untrue. And I'll elaborate on that. Press responsibility and readership of foreign news. Now we are still concerned with foreign news, but we're looking at the idea of the press, who's not, wonderful and delightful, may sometimes do things that are worrisome and maybe unethical, and so we need to think about press responsibility. Clapper's book, he was a student of Paul Lazarsfeld, and he wrote a book, The Effects of Mass Communication, ironically, because he said there were no effects of mass communication. And he was working for a television news, CBS, I think, working for television news division at the time he published his dissertation, which is this. And it was in his vested interest to show that that things that come on television, both entertainment and news, do not have a strong impact on the public, because at this time, television had been alive in the United States for about 12 years. And there was concern that among parents that kids were being negatively affected by television. So there were stirrings at that point that television might have negative effects on kids. And Clapper says, no, don't worry about it. Then Geiber, again writing about just journalism, talks about the role of sources and reporters. I'm going through all of this, Akiva, because my point at the end is going to be, wow, we're studying the same stuff that we've always been studying. Guido Stempel, who was a personal mentor of mine, or is, talked about selectivity of readership of political news. I put this on the micro level because he's talking about how individual people select news. Now, we think today that the internet has caused this partisan divide, that people can select the topics they want to see, what ranking they want to see them on the page according to their own idea of importance, and how much of it they want to see. And that has somehow caused the partisan divide that we see in the United States. So selectivity has actually been discussed for a long time. The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere by Habermas, tremendously influential piece, sociological, about how, does he actually talk about a media in that book? Yes. Talks about the role of media in the public sphere, and later people start talking about media spheres. But it's all essentially one thing. It's society, but it's society in which communication occurs, both mass communication and interpersonally. 4 Theories of the Press was published to show that not all countries treat news alike. And so he had, 4 different types of countries. Marshall McLuhan, another Canadian, wrote Of Man in '64, and he was the author of the cool media, warm media idea that the media is the message, and stuff like that. Professionalism among newsmen, McLeod and Hawley, '64. Propaganda by Jacques Ellul in '65. A very, very influential piece, and shows that propaganda was still considered to be a very important issue in 1965, many years since Laswell's 20-some book about propaganda in World War. The Opinion Makers, this is just journalism, I think. But I put it on the micro level because this is a piece that discusses people who make opinions, which can be sources, can be people, just normal people. There are no normal people in news, but there could be normal people outside of news. But mostly journalists are the people who make the news, and they interact with public officials. Who Can or Should Evaluate the Press by Merrill. Again, an ethical text. Issues are coming up, especially with television, about whether the media are acting in an ethical manner. We saw earlier professionalism. Well, this goes hand in hand with ethical behaviors. And Fred Friendly, who sort of invented television news, wrote Due to Circumstances Beyond Our Control in '67. Wilbur Schramm, who is in the United States considered the father of our field of the study of mass communication. He was an academic who made the study of communication theoretical, when previous to that it had just been the practice of journalism, how to learn the skills. Again, newspaper gatekeeping comes up. Robert Park, a sociologist, on social control and collective behavior, was also very influential in many researchers. Now we're to 1969, which is not the date I see, but again, gatekeeping, Blumler's symbolic interactionism. My doctoral student, who's my research assistant, is using symbolic interactionism in her own research today. And the process of legitimation was very important to my work, Miliband, because it eventually led to my study of how the media could affect the political legitimacy of political interest groups. Journalists at Work by Tunstall, a nice book, but about the practice of journalism. Here's Lazarsfeld again. We really can't get rid of him. And Gramsci, the Prison Notebooks of, who's edited by somebody else, introduces the idea. I guess I should have put Marx in there before. I just couldn't think of everything. Thanks. And but Gramsci was in prison for a long time, and he was essentially writing about why the workers in the West never revolted. And he came up with the idea that they never revolted because people in power intuitively do things to make workers happy. And it's not coercion, and it's not even deliberate or conscious, but it's just what happens in the media. But this is not, again, not such a happy theory, because hegemonic systems exert very strong influences by anyone who is in it. I am part of the American hegemonic system, and I cannot clearly see anything else other than that. And you as Israelis perhaps are in this hegemonic system, cannot really see what the United States is about. Many of you have worked in the United States and lived there, but hegemony is a kind of an explanation for evil behaviors in most research and communication. And the question is, are the media acting as hegemonic forces? That is, are they making the workers happy? Are they working for the government? Or are they just part of this kind of laissez-faire social system in which they do their stuff because that's what they do, and the workers become happy? So that was hegemony. Wow. This was a true spark plug in research, not just in communication, but in political science. McCombs and Shaw in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, did a very simple study looking at content in the local newspaper about big topics like war, education, economy, stuff like that, and then surveyed people and asked them the MIP question, most important problem question, that's on many surveys today. What is the most important problem facing the nation, or what is the most important problem facing our community? And so people said these big topic areas, and they correlated them and found a very strong correlation. They didn't know at the time whether people's need for information on these topics was driving the media's content about these topics, or whether the newspaper content was driving public opinion. This is a question, and this still goes on today, but this was one of the most influential articles. Now, just journalism again. Krauss actually went on the bus with the officials and people who hope to be elected as officials to see how the news media performed during an election campaign. And it was a very interesting piece, but not particularly theoretical. Johnston, Slosky, and Bowman did write a theoretical piece about professionalism. And this original article decided that there are two kinds of journalists: those who just pass along information as they get it to the public without changing it in any significant way. And those who are, I think of them as investigative reporters, you know, they are out there looking for information that should be sent to the public. So there's, you know, neutral reception of information, passing it along like a sponge receiving water and then swishing it out at the end. And then there are the people who are trying to go out and find other information, and then they pass that on if the editor approves. Wow, I hit the keyboard. Bad decision. I think I can fix it right here. Okay, shouldn't do that. Reporters and Officials is one of the important books preceding Gann's work. And Siegel was very interested in how journalists and public officials work together. Does one control the other? Are they equally balanced? That kind of thing. And now we have news as purposive behaviors. Two sociologists looked at an environmental disaster, and they wanted to know how news about this disaster was communicated to the public. And although they were sociologists, I put this under just journalism. And News from Nowhere by Epstein, very provocative, and Imperative of Freedom by Merrill again. Reporting the Yom Kippur War from Israel by Goran Cohen and Caspi in 1975. I originally took Akiba's CV and just added everything from his CV. And I eventually realized that I would fill most of the years, because in any given year he had published 3 or 4 things. So I had to make some cuts, Akiba. But your work turns out to be absolutely very important and critical in this line of study. Al-Thidi wrote Creating Reality, which reflects the idea that journalists do not just pass on what comes to them, that in fact they massage the information. They go get information from people who don't volunteer it. They mix all this information together, and eventually it goes out, and people think of what's on the television news and what's in the newspaper as being real, as representing the real world. But news never represents the real world, if there is such a thing. It is creating a sense of reality, of what the world is like. Cohen, Wiegand, and Harrison, Effects of Emotion Arousing Events on Children's Attention to and Learning from TV News. Now, as we will see along the way, there are not many psychological works, but this is one of the first, and you can tell that he had a major professor who was also interested in cognitive theory from psychology. Capitalism, Communication and Class Relations, Murdoch and Golding. This is, again, the kind of hegemonic type approach about why Marxism did not take over in the West. Now, very different thing in psychology, flashbulb memories. A flashbulb memory is about something extremely important to you that happens. If a relative is killed in an airplane crash, I mean, that you would have a flashbulb memory of where you were at the moment that that occurred. Type of event, again, Cohen. A profile of newspaper and TV reporters. Discovering the News by Schudson, a mighty good theorist and historian. Inventing reality, again, inventing the people's sense of what the world is like. Parenti. Gay Tuckman, Making News. On the meaning and validity of television viewing. What does it mean to watch television? And Power and Powerless by Parenti, and putting reality together for the BBC News. And here we have Gans, deciding what's news. Now Gans, obviously, as I've just shown you, did not develop the idea that news is an important thing to study out of nowhere. There was a lot of research before him, and he took from what came before him, as we all do as scholars. The same year, Halberstein's The Powers That Be. The word power occurs over and over and over again in research about news. This relationship between the media and society, the media and government, the media and the elite, what in political elite or business elite or just elites. Children's fear responses to real life violence. Again, 2 pieces by Cohen here, the same year. And community conflict in the press. Starts looking at individual communities and how the media actually are part of the community. They find that the editor of the newspaper is on the community council that makes decisions about the community. So part of the, okay, wow. Okay, manufacturing the news factory. The Whole World is Watching, which was a hegemonic study. Media Power and Politics. The Symbolic Annihilation of Women. This is not, Tuckman is writing about the fact that women do not appear in the news. That at this time, in pre-1981, there were very few women reporters, and there were very few women sources and very few women anywhere. And that had a negative impact on women's role in society. Abel writes What's News? Beyond Agenda Setting by Oscar Gandy. Groupthink. Janice was a psychologist, I think, but he's talking about how journalists and editors, when in a group and talking to each other, tend to reinforce the opinions of each other and don't really absorb new ideas. Individuals in media organization, keeping the gates for gatekeepers, and so on. My first published work, as I said, deviant political groups and political legitimacy, creating media culture, differential perceptions of social conflicts, mediated political realities, news, politics of illusion. Do you see a pattern here? I mean, we're getting the same thing over and over and over again. But each person builds on the past. Each person builds on the scholars before him. And even though the topics are very similar, they become much more sophisticated. New information order, Thoreau's media industries, the constitution of society, again, to study the power issue, and government and officials, how newspaper content is changing, minorities in the media finally are coming up as a topic. Not before then. In the United States, the issue of ethnic minorities was not at all a topic to worry about for news. Repairing the news, what happens when somebody invents, plagiarizes an event, when a journalist makes up the news and later people find out about it? What does the organization do to repair the news? Perceptions of equality between the sexes on TV and social reality. This is one of the earliest works that looks at gender as an issue. Source reliance, statehood reporting. The media elite, America's power brokers, was very influential. Lichter, Rothman, and Lichter. Social World, Howland, Uncensored War, about Vietnam. I know we have to finish. So I'm going to go very quickly through, and I'm going to go to current time. I apologize for the technical difficulties that caused me to stand around and do nothing for a long time. So, for those of you who can speed read, you can get the message here. Okay, we're in the 2000s now, and we're talking about women in the newsroom, that gender influences what's there. And Bourdieu in the journalistic field, a sociological piece, convergence, that all the media are coming together to be owned by the same organizations, which is a very long process. It's been going on forever and has resulted in very few people, very few companies owning most of the media. There's News Around the World, Shoemaker and Cohen. Reality TV, editors about mobile news, the news pyramid, and now we're talking about bloggers and online journalism, and again, agenda setting, journalism, blogging relationship. I know I'm over time. I apologize for being over time, but I just want to give you a sense of what's happening today in media research. There's a lot of research about the internet and how it affects news and globalization. A year earlier it was called foreign news. Now suddenly globalization is a theory that goes on. And this is geography of online news, who's fair among the American media, a psychological piece. Here's dead ground, where, as far as countries go, they are dead ground in the news. They never appear. And sensationalism in TV news, frames in a web of culture, gatekeeping theory, war on terror, framing. Framing theory at this point in time becomes very popular. Framing discusses not the topic in the news, but the way in which the topic is given context so that the audience understands it in a certain way. And I just wanted to show you that research on news is happening all over the world. I'm confident there are very important things that I have not discussed, but you can see I eliminated many things. Health communication is now also a big topic, mostly because the U.S. government funds research into health communication. So we get a lot of research about it because there's money there. Global journalism, understanding content, knowledge acquisition, global warming coverage, global village. And These are projected for the coming year, benefits and pitfalls of comparative research on news. I got this off your CV, Akiba, that's coming, so you need to make sure. Third edition of Mediating the Message, Curbing the Power of the Media Elite. So we're still talking about power, and that's the end. So thank you very much for tolerating all of my little problems, but I hope you get the broad view of what's been happening. Much the same has been happening, and because it's much the same, a tenure committee may say to you, wow, you know, that's not new. Everybody's been studying power for a long time. And what you need to say is that power is a topic that has been studied a long time, but in new and more sophisticated ways all the time. Thank you very much.